Hi. Uh, Hi, it's Rick S., Director of Education Policy Studies at AEI. Great to have you with us today for Getting Higher Education Right. We're going to have a lively conversation that takes off from the book Mike McShane and I recently wrote, Getting Education Right, a conservative vision for improving early childhood, K-12, and college. Thank you, Andy. Dude, you could be like Wheel of Fortune, man. Um, What we want to do is we want to talk about what does it look like to solve problems in higher ed. I mean, right now, I think everybody on this call is aware with a lot of the craziness we're seeing unfolding on campus, across the land, a lot of the problems with FAFSA, with student lending and the rest. And we'll talk about all of that, I'm sure. But it's really easy to kind of get caught up in that and really focus on what's wrong. And we don't want to ignore that by any means, but we also want to talk about, well, where are we trying to go? What's the goal? What does it look like to start to get these things right? That was the intuition when Mike and I wrote the book, and that's what we're trying to draw out in these conversations. So I couldn't imagine a better set of folks to have this conversation about where are we trying to go. With us, we've got my co-author Mike McShane, director of national research at EdChoice, and an adjunct fellow at AEI. We've got my AEI colleague, AEI senior fellow Beth Akers. We've got Wayne Lewis, dear old friend and president of Houghton University. And we've got Andy Smerick, another valued old friend and a senior fellow at the invaluable Manhattan Institute. What I think we'll do is I'm just going to throw each of these folks a question to get us started, and then we'll go around. Before we do, one other announcement is you saw Andy hold up the Getting Ed Right book. Through May 15th, I'm informed, if you enter the code AEI on the Teachers College Press website, you get a 20% discount. That's like free money. What could be better in this economy? Also, you'll see Alana's email on the event page. If you want to send a question, email it to her, and she will make sure it gets to me. With that, Wayne, well, would you be kind enough to kick us off? Here's the question. Um, we've seen what's going on at so many campuses right now with the cheering for Hamas and the riot police and the rest. But I'm curious in a less dramatic sense. Where are we at the culture of higher ed right now? Where are we when we think about work and rigor and expectations, kind of more broadly? Are we in a good place? Have we recovered from the pandemic? Um, should we have the same kinds of concerns in higher ed that we have around, say, chronic absenteeism or grade inflation when we talk about K-12? What's your take?
Well, thanks for the invitation, Rick. It's great to be here with friends and colleagues. I think many of the challenges that we faced pre-pandemic continue to be challenges, but some of those have been exacerbated. So I think it's no secret to anyone that some of the challenges of preparedness, academic preparedness, that we saw pre-pandemic, particularly, unfortunately, with students that come from more economically disadvantaged backgrounds, have gone to school districts that are lower performing school districts. Um, in many cases, the gaps that we saw, the academic deficits that we saw preceding the pandemic, they've been exacerbated. Those gaps are even more pervasive now. In addition, I'd say beyond categories of economically disadvantaged students or affluent students, just widespread, we're seeing more challenges in terms of social and emotional wellness. I've rarely talked to a university administrator that's not seriously considering how you expand access to resources, expand access to care, whether those are things that we're providing ourselves at the university level or referring students to partnering agencies, to other resource partners to tend to their wellness needs. I think there's definitely some trauma that we're dealing with, that we're all dealing with since the pandemic, and universities are facing that. The other thing I think I'd be remiss if I didn't comment on is cost. Cost continues to be an extraordinary challenge. for families that are particularly first generation families, economically disadvantaged families. And I don't think we're making much, if any, meaningful progress across the system in dealing with costs. And then directly related to what we're seeing right now, we have this challenge of higher education in too many cases, public institutions becoming ideological echo chambers, where there's not nearly enough diversity of thought, diversity of opinion to provide the type of educational experience that we say we want to provide for young people.
Beth, Wayne just mentioned this question of cost. One of the ways that we've been trying to help folks afford college is through federal direct student lending and through federal aid. We've come through, we're going to have a mix of folks with us today, some of whom follow this stuff closely, others less so. You want to give folks kind of a sense of where we are, both in terms of this FAFSA turmoil that has not garnered very much attention in the press, perhaps surprisingly, and then with what the Biden administration is currently doing on student lending and loan forgiveness.
Yeah, let's start with the FAFSA piece. So, I feel like the word FAFSA is going to turn most people off from the conversation if they don't already know what it is. But let's talk quickly about what it is. It's this application to get federal student aid dollars. That's federal loans or Pell Grant dollars. Anybody who's going to higher ed needs to fill out this application in order to get those resources. For a long time, we've known that that application has been a barrier to particularly their most disadvantaged students to getting into college. So Congress did something about it. Amazingly, go Congress. They actually got this done, and they passed the, legislation to get in place a simplified FAFSA. So then they handed off to Department of Education. This was a couple years ago, and it was on Department of Education to implement this new form to make it this easy to use application for people to get federal financial aid. Lo and behold, it has been totally botched. And so we are now in a position where students should have been applying for aid, should have been receiving financial aid packages, but because this application is just simply not working, we have this entire class of students who's just up a creek, and we're going to end up with a huge decline in enrollment this coming year because of it. I'm certain that when we do the retrospective studies, we're going to see that it's the most disadvantaged students who were left out of enrollment this year because of this botch. And it's hard not to point out that the Department of Education has been really busy doing things that I think they probably shouldn't be doing, that I think the Constitution suggests they shouldn't be doing. And so, it's kind of hard to swallow that this thing that Congress succeeded in making room for to, really help the students who need the most help. It just like the ball was dropped. And, I think Miguel Cardona, Secretary of Education, is probably feeling pretty okay right now that everybody's looking at Columbia and the protests and the encampments, because it's taking some of the heat off of the failures in this space, which are going to be really long lasting. So it's honestly hard to even overstate how big of a problem it is, even though it sounds wonky and it sounds down in the weeds. But for those families who are applying for financial aid this year, wanted to apply to financial aid this year, I mean, this is huge. This is a huge deal. Rick, you're talking, but I think you're muted.
Yep, sorry. When we say families applying for financial aid, are we talking about the 10% of forced families? Are we talking about what percentage of families apply for financial aid?
Oh gosh, I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I know that the rates of application that we've seen so far, usually the Department of Education is publishing that along as we go, are significantly down. But most families should be applying for financial aid at this point. Strategically, it makes sense for everyone. I mean, the people who benefit the most from applying are the lowest income, because those are the people getting access to Pell Grants, which are basically just cash. Although getting access to student loans these days is basically like getting cash too, because of the reforms that the Biden administration have been making over the course of the past 3 years. And so I guess that's a good opportunity to transition to what we've been seeing there. Over the past decade, really, we've seen kind of expansions of the safety nets for people who take on student loans. What does that mean? That means if you borrow and it's unaffordable for you, we've been trying through policy to make it so that you don't have to pay back your loans. Sounds okay. But then now take it to the extreme, which the administration has done, kind of testing the boundaries of what is legal under the Constitution and what the White House really has the authority to do. And effectively, we've created a loan program that demands almost no one pay back the money that they've borrowed, which has this trickle down effect, all kinds of perverse incentives for higher education in general. Loans aren't loans. They're basically just a convoluted grant program. We're giving out money to people who know how to game the system. If you're smart, you're taking out lots of loans and using it to pay for a car and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, things are broken. But I will say the advantage or the silver lining of this moment that we've really seen the administration just completely deconstruct, the system to the point where it no longer has any like policy or like mechanical coherence, is that we're just going to be starting over. If we want to bring back a functioning higher ed finance system, we're building from scratch. And I think that gives us the opportunity to think about what are the things that are important. And, if that were on me, I'd be saying we've gotten away from the notion of value, that college degrees need to be contributing, giving something back, both to the students who are paying for them and the taxpayers who are supporting them. It's a really basic principle that seems to have gotten lost, over the course of the trends of buzzwords over the course of the past few decades. We've had access, meaning everybody should get into college. Then, we realized that people weren't finishing. So then completion was the buzzword. And along the way, we lost track that, what's the point of access or completion if these things aren't worth anything? And so I think that this moment gives us an opportunity to recenter the conversation around, to steal from my book title, Making College Pay. And we can disagree about what that means. How do we want it to pay? But it should pay. And having that conversation as we think about rebuilding from what is now a completely, deconstructed system, I think is where we are.
And Beth, just for folks who haven't been tracking this super closely, the Biden administration plan that the Supreme Court found to be unconstitutional had an cap for how much you could earn and still, but was it 250,000, I think, right?
Right, 250,000 for couples, right?
Now, the current loan forgiveness, is it still capped at 250?
Oof, you caught me. I'm not sure I know that limit. Maybe
no, I think it is. Right? I think there's no limits. I think
Yeah.
we're giving, I think we're giving tens of thousands of dollars to folks who got, who earn half a million or more because they went to law school or B school. And
yes, exactly. That's correct. And the estimates are proving that to be true, that when we look at the analyses of who's benefiting, it is these very highest earners, which is, of course, problematic.
Which is crazy, especially, it's crazy. Andy, I mean, so we've talked a little bit about, Beth's talking about is obviously federal policy, but obviously a huge piece of what happens in higher ed is state policy. I mean, 80% of folks wind up at public institutions. We talk a lot about the Ivies, but the actions in the publics. You sit on in the board in Maryland overseeing Maryland's public colleges and universities. You've been working with board members and trustees in your role at MI. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the opportunities and challenges when it comes to getting leadership pointed in the right direction on these campuses? And what are you seeing that either makes you nervous or gives you hope?
Well, thanks for having me. Let me begin on one of the final things you mentioned, which dovetails with something that Beth said at the beginning, and then I want to make a broader point. So something that brings me concern is this FAFSA issue, and it's a good talking point because it makes the administration look like they fumbled the ball, which they did. But this could have a much bigger influence than I think a lot of people recognize right now. There are a lot of universities that even before COVID were struggling with enrollment. The huge enrollment days were already over. Then COVID hit, and a lot of universities lost enrollment, and they were just trying to bounce back from that. They're concerned about what is often called the enrollment cliff. So 18 years after the 2007-2008 fertility drop because of the Great Recession, there are going to just be fewer college-age students going to college in 2025, 26, 27. So a lot of universities were already worried about their enrollment, trying to get it up. Most schools are not like Harvard or like a flagship where they have many, many more applicants and spots available. A lot of universities struggle to make sure they hit their enrollment numbers. The last thing they needed was something like this FAFSA error to happen. We may see serious enrollment drops in a number of schools, especially among universities that serve disadvantaged students, regional universities, and that'll be bad for kids and could be bad for a whole host of schools that don't get a whole lot of attention. So that's one of these things that doesn't maybe really make it to the front page of newspapers, but is the kind of thing that board members think about. And so this is sort of my segue into how at least I and the public board members that I know think about a lot of issues, which is we love our schools and we're committed to them. And as you know, Rick, I sort of up in the right of center ed reform K-12 movement. And in hindsight, I think I made a bunch of mistakes in terms of tenor and posture. Like I always began discussions in K-12 with our schools are broken, everything's busted, we have to start all over. And that ended up landing badly on a whole lot of people because it wasn't their experience. A lot of families at the K-12 level, they like their schools and they give them pretty high grades. If I had started those conversations with, there's some serious problems in some schools, there's more minor problems in other schools that we got to fix, I think I would have engendered, and people like me would have engendered more support and more trust if we had been more measured in the way we talked about it. So sometimes I see the same thing happen in higher education. So often those of us who can get frustrated with some things that are happening, we can paint with a broad brush the things that are happening in higher education. So think of it this way. If there are 20, 30, 40 universities right now that are really being gripped by these protests right now, that's on the cover of every newspaper. But that would be like 1% of all higher education institutions in America, 1%, 40 out of 4,000. So if we begin the conversation of higher ed reform by talking about the worst things, a lot of higher ed board members and legislators are thinking, you're not really talking about the universities I know about or the ones that I went to or the ones that I care about. So I think one good lesson to take in all of this is try to meet legislators, board members where they are, which is they want to make improvements. They don't want to hear that everything is wrong because people in Ohio love Ohio State. People in Alabama would be thrilled if their kids got into the flagship university. Address thoughtfully the tough problems that are out there. Don't hide them. We have to deal with them, but also be thoughtful that a lot of these board members and legislators are thinking about, do we move into credentials and licenses and badges, or do we keep doing just 4-year? How do we deal with this new generation of non-traditional students who are older or maybe come in with more credits? How do we think about solving the humanities liberal arts crisis? Now, none of these issues are like dramatic for a lot of people who do reform, but that's the stuff that a lot of board members are thinking about. They love their schools. They want to make them better. Help them, I would say to all of us, let's help them make their schools better.
And Andy, on some of this stuff, on the debates around, say, DEI programming and DEI bureaucracies, or on administrative bloat. I mean, I think one of the concerns on the right is the sense that, boy, we've been asleep at the switch. Even in red states, we've got folks who are in charge of public institutions, and they've just let this stuff grow in unhealthy and out of control ways. Is that a fair critique? If it is a fair critique, what's happened and what's changing or what needs to change?
Well, I can't speak for all of these 4,000 universities, and I know much more about the public ones than I do the private ones. So I'll just say this. Governors have an enormous amount of power to appoint board members of public institutions. In a number of states, they're elected, the boards of regents, boards of trustees, but in most places, and in some cases, the legislature has a role. But governors, if they prioritize something, they could influence all or most of the public IHEs in their state within the span of a term by appointing new board members, and give them a charge like, I care about the humanities, make sure that you focus on this, or I care about bloat, or the GPAs rising too much. Governors can have a huge influence on this, and board members, let me just say this. There's this view, I think, often in Washington, D.C., that everyone in public life just wants to get on TV. They just want to become famous. My experience at the state level is the exact opposite. Most of these people, they care about their institutions. They care about their charge. They don't want to become famous for a scandal, or they're not looking at this as like a platform. What they want to do is just hunker down and do the work as best as they can. And so most of these people are completely responsible, highly accomplished. And the more we talk to them about, here are the things you can do to make things better, they're not going to look at it as just a way to run for office in the future. They're going to want to solve the problem.
Mike, before I throw it to you, Wayne, I'm just kind of curious, both on this FAFSA question and the way Andy was, obviously you guys are a private rather than a public institution. And so I'm just curious if your relationship with the board is, similar to or different from what Andy talked about, and how FAFSA has been playing out for you guys.
Yeah, so the quicker one is FAFSA. This is one of those things that, whether you're public or private, you're experiencing it pretty similarly. It's without question, in my mind, the greatest failure on the Department of Education ever, without a close second. And it's having a really significant impact on institutions and trying to make sense of what your budgets are going to look like next year. But the most devastating impact it's having is on families and young people. And I think especially about young people coming from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, first generation college students. I think the impacts of how this is going to prevent a whole cohort of people pursuing higher education. I think we're going to see the impacts of this for a long, long time to come. On the board's question, though, the private for private institutions, it's a very different dynamic. Whereas governors have the opportunity to have a really significant influence on boards, presidents at private institutions actually have a really probably more than any other person, an outsized influence on who a private institution board becomes. Now, board members at most private institutions are elected by the boards themselves, but the president most often has a really significant role in the nomination, the vetting, and the recommendation of prospective board members to the board. So over the course of a presidency, it's not uncommon that a board at a private institution starts to look more and more like the president.
Which explains a lot of what we're seeing with the groupthink situation and some of the
obvious. Or worse.
Yeah, can I just add one thing to that, Rick?
Yeah.
Because that you hit it here, and this is something I think for a lot of folks to think about as they're thinking about like the universities that are having struggles right now. In most cases, a public board of a public institution at higher education, in general, appointed by a governor through a public process, often confirmed by the state senate through a public process. All of their meetings are public because of Open Meetings Act. All of their meeting minutes are available. Even their committee meetings are public. That shapes that institution in a very interesting and I think positive way. With some of these private organizations, private schools, if it's the case that you don't really know who's getting appointed, you don't know what they're doing in their meetings, if they get to choose one another, it's self-perpetuating. There isn't even a flip in party control. You can start to see how the shape, the environment of that school can be different than one that is shaped by all of these public, transparent measures that we see in the public sector.
Mike, this all brings up two things that you talk about a lot and that we write about in the book. One is the role of leaders and, setting the culture of campus and the kind of leadership, failure, I think, that we've seen at so many over the last 6 months. And then second, thinking about schools as formative institutions or colleges as formative institutions rather than performative platforms. So I'm curious, where are we right now? Is what we're seeing kind of just 30 or 40 institutions that are getting it wrong, or is it a broader problem? And what does it look like? How do we think about starting to get leadership and kind of the formative role of colleges pointed in the right direction?
Yeah, it's funny. You and I wrote a piece for the Dispatch a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was titled the title they went with was "Don't Burn Down Harvard." Now it's funny, in the interim time period, if you just saw that headline today, you would think we were pleading with protesters. We were actually talking about something different, the sort of attitude that we should have towards these institutions. And I think, look, one of the things that we talk about in the book, and we talk about it across, when we're talking about early childhood, or we're talking about K-12 or others, is that for conservatives to have a positive impact on these institutions, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So on one level, we have to look at the existing set of institutions that we have and do everything that we can to reform and improve them. I think that abandoning these institutions in as shabby of a shape as many of them are in, you can't make new 350-year-old institutions. You just can't. And so as a result, like, we need to care about what they're teaching and who is leading them and playing a role in all of that. And I think, we spend a lot of time in the book talking about trying to change some of the professional norms and the sort of general norms of these institutions. I think, like, in short, like, we think professors should be working more, and we think that students should be studying harder, and we should be thinking about the incentives and all the things that go into that. We think, grade inflation plays a role in this. And so there are concrete steps that we can take thinking about these existing institutions, the people that run them, the people that work in them, the incentives that are there to try and make them better. At the same time, the kind of chewing gum that we have to do while we're walking is thinking about new institutions, thinking about how do we create new institutions that both solve the sort of problems of today, but also can exert pressure on these schools. I mean, it's wild, as we talk about in the book, this thing of, like, the Ivy League is out of touch and isn't connected in what they're supposed to do is not a new sentiment. And, like, 150 years ago, the titans of industry of that time period got together and said, yeah, these institutions aren't working for us, so let's create ones for today. And now they're some of the finest institutions in America. They're named after these people: Leland Stanford, Andrew Carnegie, right? I don't know. It wasn't like Bill Duke. I don't know what Duke. Anyway, but right. So, like, a lot of these new institutions were created. Look. So it makes me think, like, I would love to see those folks of today, maybe some of the titans of the information age, doing the same thing, trying to create new institutions. Because, look, there's that old saying that the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago, and the second best time is today. So I would have loved nothing more than when God and Man at Yale came out in 1951, if people had gotten together and said, hey, we should create a new institution that, answers some of these questions. Didn't exactly happen. It would have been great in 1968, the last time Columbia burned, if people got together and said we needed to create. Well, then in 1987, when the Closing of the American Mind came out, that would have been awesome too. We would have had 30 years to go at this time. All of those things, it would have been better for it to happen. It hasn't. It would be great to do now.
One of the challenges for institutions, kind of new or old, is that you have, especially when it comes to the humanities, the social sciences, you have this overwhelming ideological tilt in the professoriate that, there's hardly anybody who identifies as right of center. There's overwhelming numbers of scholars who are left of center. And this may not matter a lot in physics or math, but it seems to matter a hell of a lot when we look at what's getting chanted when it comes to teaching students sociology or anthropology or history or literature. Is there if folks can really seem, this can really seem like an insuperable barrier. You have the faculty you have. If you build new institutions, they get filled with what you got. Old institutions, you're fighting against where the faculty are. Is this a smaller problem than I'm making it out to be? Or if not, are there ways that we can start to address this over time?
I think it's a massive.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Wayne.
I think it's a massive problem, and I see the challenge very similar to the way you do, with one wrinkle that I'll add. I do believe that ideologically, the faculty across higher education certainly leans left, probably leans heavily left. But I think the composition of the student body as well as the faculty is more ideologically diverse than people realize. I think one of the things that's happening is you have, in fact, students who are scared to death to let it be known that they don't necessarily align with the dominant talking points of the day. And you have faculty who, in order to get hired, and passed oftentimes the the hiring litmus test, and to keep their jobs and being able to publish and be promoted and continue to be in good standing with their colleagues at their institution in the field, they wouldn't dare let anyone know that they're center, much less right of center. And so I think this ideological challenge that we're talking about is a massive one. I don't think it's understated at all. And I think we have to meaningfully address it. We have to first acknowledge that we have a problem and then take some affirmative steps to address it.
How do you start? Oh, Beth.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting one, and all the conversation on this issue tends to be about how to regain or achieve balance on campuses. And, as I'm watching this evolve, I tend to think the solution may not be there, and it kind of relates to the last thing that you just asked us about institutions being formative institutions versus being platforms to provide opportunity for performance. And, I think I'm actually okay with the idea that we're moving in the direction of having diversity across institutions. Obviously there's been a big stand in Florida to take the institutions there in a more conservative direction. And we're seeing, institutes within institutions across the country that are celebrating conservative thought in a new way. I tend to think that's, where we're going to make progress, which is, either taking institutions or portions of institutions and creating a home or a safe space, if you will, for conservative thought there. I think it's much more challenging and less realistic that we get to a place of balance, but I also think it's okay, because I think we've moved away from the idea that an institution can be anything other than just this vanilla place where students call the shots. We can let institutions be something, and if they want to be progressive or they want to be conservative, I think that's okay. We have a competition, the marketplace of institutions. Students choose. We don't have a public assigned system in higher ed, so we don't have to think of balance in the same way that we would at K-12. So those are just my 2 cents.
One of the things that raises is, I just heard Wayne saying that, part of what can look like imbalance is that students or faculty are scared to challenge orthodoxies, that prefer, professional reasons, professional incentives. Hell, academic associations make it very clear that there's proper ideological stands. So for what Beth just described to work, it also sounds like there needs to be some kind of infrastructure or leadership or attention on campus to changing the climate so that folks don't feel afraid to challenge reigning orthodoxies, so that academics feel like they can still get employed, even if they're asking, questions that are out of favor. How do we move in that direction?
Well, there are probably a handful of things. One is starting at the most basic. Which of our universities have signed onto the Chicago Statement or something similar to it? So are you on record as a university and the leadership of the university saying that you believe in enlightenment and scientific method style approaches to the accumulation of knowledge? Do you think that it's important to have a wide array of ideas at the table to contest hypotheses, making sure that people are different and have the ability to freely inquiry and speak and disagree with one another? Are you creating that kind of environment? Now, that is one definition of diversity that's important, and that should be on the table. You can learn a lot about a university. Have they signed one of those statements? How does FIRE rate them on their green, yellow, red metrics of how hospitable are you? So this is a statement that a board or university leaders could sign on to. Another is just the recognition of affinity bias, that all of us, and this goes back in the social science literature years and years, all of us have this unfortunate bias of liking to surround ourselves with people like us. We plus up. We like to elevate people who are like us, went to the same schools as us, think the same things as us. This is true of all organizations, of all people, apparently. Universities are no different. So if it starts to skew to one side or the other, they're going to hire more people like them. A recognition of that would be very helpful in open discussions. And then the last thing is, a couple of you alluded to it. We are seeing this growing body of centers within universities at North Carolina, Florida, and some other places. Sometimes they're called institutes for civics or public life, that if not explicitly, then implicitly are going to be more about free speech, free inquiry, diversity of ideas, and that's a good step. I worry that that is one way of cordoning off free speech, as though it doesn't need to be across an entire university, but at least it's moving in the right direction, and that's being led in some cases by boards, and in other cases by state legislators.
Wayne, I mean, you've clearly, you've wrestled with this a lot. I'm curious if you have additional thoughts on how institutions can make sure that those folks you're talking about who feel embattled or bullied aren't, don't get stopped from speaking up, from making sure that campuses are reflecting a broader palette of ideas.
Yeah, I'm currently I'm the president of an evangelical Christian university, and so I completely agree with the marketplace of higher education institutions that Beth is talking about in the private sector, though. For me, um, the private sector I feel like is the place for that. For instance, for young people to and for graduate studies, for people to be able to find institutions that either mirror what a public institution is supposed to be and is appropriate for anyone who's looking to come get a great education, or one that has a slight ideological bent toward it. I don't think that's a problem in the private sector. The challenge I have is I don't think that's appropriate in the public sector. If for no other reason, and I think there are some good reasons, but the top one for me is young people across the state, especially those who don't come from affluent backgrounds, will primarily be served by public institutions. There's no way in the near term that that's not going to be the case, and for that reason, making sure every public institution is an institution that is not an indoctrination factory, but that does celebrate, affirm, uphold the widest possible breadth in terms of ideology, philosophy, and provides young people with an education that's the same, that's fair, no matter what their background is. I think that's extraordinarily important. That is not happening today. It frankly is not. I think, we could certainly have some conversation on some steps we could take to do that. I think, quite honestly, presidential leadership is huge in that. Presidential leadership, leadership at the provost level, people who are committed to making sure that we are hiring in that regard. I also think we have to recognize that because we've not operated this way for so long, and we do have really sometimes really stiff biases in one particular direction on a faculty, I mean, we may have to go in and do some sometimes really significant policy change to correct things that we've been doing in the recent past that have kept either kept people out because they don't have the right ideology or the right philosophy, um, or to remove things that get in the way of them being promoted and them being advancing in their careers. There are lots of those things I think we need to address. Last thing I'll say is just anecdotal. I currently serve as a private university president. I've spent most of my career though in the public sector and a public university. Um, there are professional associations that I used to frequent, go to meetings, that I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be welcomed at anymore. Because when I was in the public sector, I knew there were just certain things in terms of what I believed or alignments that I had that I just needed to be quiet about in order to get along. I mean, since my leadership's been much more public over the last decade, I know for a fact I would not be welcome in those spaces anymore. And that's just not okay. We're going to have to make some changes in that.
All right, we're starting to get a bunch of questions, so let's hit a few of these, and then I want to get us into some other stuff. A question: it seems most traditional four-year colleges spend millions on administrators, glamorous facilities, and athletic programs, while community colleges appear to avoid many of these costs and offer affordable prices to students. How can community colleges help address higher ed soaring costs?
Ooh, can I take this one? So this is a common one. I mean, people really like to blame like the climbing walls and the lazy rivers and all of like the different officers on campuses like driving the increase in costs. And I actually think it's really misguided. So this is a piece of it. And then I'll get to the what can community colleges piece do? You know, for one, I think empirically speaking, those things, if you look at their contribution to costs, are not what's driving the increase in inflation over time. You have to like zoom back out and look at more of an economic story. I think the bigger explanation for why prices have increased at the rate that they have is because they can. And they can because we've told everybody that you're a loser if you don't have a college degree and you should go out and get it and you don't have to pay back your loans. I mean, there's like a whole host of reasons why these prices have been allowed through laws of supply and demand to increase over time. And I think this is an easy one.
Where does that money go? Where does that money go if it's not mostly like the lazy rivers and the climbing walls?
Well, I mean, teaching is an incredibly labor-intensive activity. So to have faculty to teach students is expensive. But I think that the bigger concern I have about that line of inquiry is that I actually don't care if an institution spends 90% of their budget on advertising or on lazy rivers. If the truth is that they're producing good results for their students, who am I to judge? I don't know the best way to run an institution, and I don't want the federal government deciding what's the best way to run an institution. People sometimes think, well, we should restrict institutions from spending on advertising. We should restrict how much they can spend on making their campuses fancy. If making your campus fancy is actually what turns out to like create the kind of networks that get people jobs, then that works. So that concerns me when we start going down the road of questioning how institutions are allocating these resources. One, I think that we're misguided in thinking that these sort of obvious ones are actually driving the cost. And two, I'm concerned about us trying to micromanage how institutions should be running themselves, because I think the best way is to put incentives in place for institutions to get good outcomes and then let them figure out where to allocate resources to make that happen. That's a ways down the road, though. When we look at low-cost providers like community colleges, it's true. I mean, on average, the net cost is negative for people going to community colleges. People are paying nothing, and you think like, wow, what a great opportunity. The other fact is that graduation rates at community colleges are atrocious. So in fact, though this sector looks like it has the potential to be serving us well, in fact, it's not succeeding in doing that. So something's missing, and maybe that something is more spending. So I love the idea. Are there ways to, compel lower cost institutions to be in the game, whether in the public or the private sector? But we can't seem to get there by just forcing it through policy. And I think that we need to, yeah.
And so to clarify for folks on the community college cost piece, so there's, the net cost of the student could be negative, or it's usually not more than, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. But that's not the cost of providing community college education, right?
Yeah, that's true.
What's the cost?
That's true too.
What's the cost per pupil of community college?
It's tough to back out what it's actually costing because of the combination of state and federal subsidies, and then the subsidies through all the different programs if you're borrowing, but then those loans ultimately get paid back by the government.
Student. So, what's it cost like the state X? Like, well, give me a ballpark range. Like a year of community college, is it cost how much? I mean, because the last numbers I remember are like 14,000 a year, give or take, 13, 14.
That sounds right. Yeah, I wouldn't push back on that. Yeah. So the resources are going to these places. They're just not coming from the students.
That's right. I mean, so the taxpayers are picking it up. And so, which is still, remarkably cheap compared to the, $89,000 to get pandemic style learning at Columbia. But there is also, but I mean, you talk about the need to get the incentives right. But it seems like we're in a situation, like as you were just explaining, with student borrowing and loan forgiveness, where the incentives are going the other way. Right now, we're incentivizing colleges to tell students to borrow more. So in that environment, it seems like the only viable option is to come down and start tying campuses' hands, because otherwise they're like, it's free money day.
Yeah, you're right. So it's like, am I thinking of the first best or the second best, policy regime here? I'm kind of thinking like, if we could get rid of kind of the craziness that's been happening with the perversion of incentives of canceling everybody's student loans after they're made, then yes, I think you could fix the problem through the correction of incentives. But you're right, given that this is the world that we live in now, maybe Like it is necessary to tie the hands of institutions. And I sort of hate that because it feels like just so far from the most efficient policy mechanism in this space. But I think you're probably right. I hate to say it, Rick, but maybe you're right.
Stop me before we waste money again. Andy, I mean, you deal with this all the time. Where are you at?
Well, yeah, so this actually touches on a small section that you have in your chapter in your book about higher education. And it's a position that I'm on the fence about, but let me try to give voice to it and like have you and Mike respond to this, which is this idea of unbundling. So as like an institutional guy, I generally think that institutions evolve over time to do a whole lot of things that are visible and invisible. And I'm often skeptical of efforts to tinker around with them because you never know which are the load-bearing walls. You just want to make sure that you take care of the entire institution. It must be smart because it's existed for so long. That's my general thinking. The nature of the question, and I think a question on a lot of people's mind is, are so many things that universities do right now absolutely necessary? Are they load-bearing walls, or can we yank some of those things out and not have the structure collapse? And when you guys wrote about unbundling, the way that I read it is a university today, a modern, large public university, for example, will have sports. It'll have a whole host of activities. It'll have one or more gigantic libraries. It'll have a bunch of buildings to take classes in, all types of activities where students can live with one another, partially live and work outside or just on the fringe of campus. There are all of these services and all of these different amenities that are part of the university experience right now. And I think what you guys were trying to get at is all that stuff necessary? Can students in the future start to think about, I don't need the library, I'm going to take my classes online. I don't really want the sports thing. I just want good instruction and maybe an internship. So in K-12, we often talk about unbundling as a way of saying you can get your math instruction from this service provider, and maybe you get your tutoring from here, or maybe get physical education somewhere else. And there is a cognate here in higher education. Are all of the things that a major university doing right now, are they all load-bearing walls, or can we start to separate them? My concern is along the lines of the university experience is extraordinarily important for a lot of people because all of those things come together, and it's the development of citizens and people who are going to work and live together, and it's a rite of passage. I believe that 90% of the way. I have my own misgivings, but the unbundling part is a way of thinking about cutting costs.
Nice. Here's another, Mike, this one, throw me through to you. Recent years have seen a growing anti-college sentiment among many conservatives, as they've witnessed university campuses come to be dominated by their progressive adversaries. How do conservatives combat this outlook and communicate the importance of college to those pessimistic about the future of higher ed?
It's a great question. I mean, part of me, as I was listening to that question, it's sort of like, imagine if I used to do CrossFit. I don't know how many are familiar, y'all, with CrossFit, which is like kind of like the, I don't know, weird way of exercising that, you know, with the old joke of don't ask people if they do CrossFit, they'll tell you first. But it's one of those things where it's like, if suddenly that's how, like, where your gym gets taken over and you don't like those people, it doesn't mean you should stop exercising. It doesn't mean that like the fundamental things that you need just because you've got these particular dipsticks running the show, right? So what I think is, and it sort of ties into what Andy was just talking about, whenever we're thinking about any of this stuff, I always try to start with like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And that was my sort of when we were writing about unbundling, but even now when we're talking about like why people should care about higher education, well, it's like, well, like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve, right? And in some of these cases, it's like advanced preparation for jobs that like you just don't get in high school. Like you need to do something beyond that to be prepared for that job. I think, but lots of the other stuff, like you need some of the stuff that Andy was talking about of like having these socializing experiences where you think of someplace like the University of Maryland, where you can have people from all across the state come together. And even in a relatively geographically small state like that, you have people that are really different. And the fact that they can all be in a dorm with one another, I think like that's an important, the fact that those people don't know each other is a problem. And that's a potential solution for it. Research, moving on the store of human knowledge. So I think rather than being like college qua college or thinking about it in these abstract terms, thinking about what colleges do, what problems they solve, what needs people have. And then it's less concerning about like who's running them at any given moment and thinking about what are the types of institutions we can have to solve those problems and help those people.
You know, Let me jump in here. I think this is a space where, there's like that dirty word nuance that we kind of need to push back. And there's this sense that like, oh, college sucks now, right? Like we don't want to go to college anymore. But I think that there's a healthy version of that, which is like to channel that into more discernment about college. And I think part of what we've seen, especially with tuition inflation, and I've written about this over and over, is that when you've told everyone how wonderful college is, that it's the golden ticket, and acted as if it's commodity, in that like the one college degree is interchangeable with another, you kind of get this like upward pressure on prices that's gotten us to where we are today. So I think the skepticism, if we can say, instead of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, say, what am I paying for, or what am I paying for, one, because a lot of people didn't even know that historically what they're paying, and what am I getting? And if we get people to make decisions that way, and so we can change this distaste or disgust with higher education into being more discerning, I think that actually pushes us in a really good direction.
All right. Question: How do we hold all of education, including higher ed, accountable for not being indoctrination factories? I mean, Wayne, you mentioned this before. Is there accountability that helps ensure that these public institutions are not indoctrination factories?
Yeah, I do. And I go back to one of the comments Andy made. In most states, the trustees of public institutions are appointed by governors. But very rarely in public conversation do you have much understanding or conversation about who governors are appointing to boards of trustees. While this is public, right? This doesn't happen in private. In most cases, even if it's a large institution, these picks are put in the newspaper. There's not really much by way of the public holding governors accountable for who they're appointing to serve as trustees, or what those trustees are doing once they're in those seats. Now, trustees play an extraordinary role in policy making. They are the chief, the body of trustees is the governance policy making institution for either the system or the institution, depending on how it's structured. But I would dare say the most significant decision and most important thing trustees do is they hire and hold accountable the president. I don't know that anything rises to that level in terms of single thing that they do. And I think there's space for trustees to do a better job in holding presidents accountable for what happens at institutions.
On a related note, you knew we were going to get here eventually. How can conservatives rightly respond to pro-Palestinian demonstrations on campus while also upholding and protecting free speech?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think
go ahead.
Our commitment as conservatives to free speech and making sure students have the opportunity to protest, to register dissent on campuses is really important, and that shouldn't change based on what students are saying. So I think that's something that I hope conservatives hold true to. Now with that said, there is speech that's happening on campuses, and we've seen this online, social media, on cable news networks, that is clearly not just in the realm of protected free speech. It is very clearly crossed the line into hate speech, into harassment. And the notion that university administrators and boards of trustees who hold university presidents accountable have been so slow to act on that, I think is shameful. I don't think there's any excuse for it. And I've heard people make this argument, which I think is absolutely right. I'll say this as an African American. If you replace Jewish students with African Americans, and you have people saying some of the same things, some of the same really nasty, hateful, harassing things that they're saying to Jewish students, to African Americans, this would be a completely different situation. I think we have to acknowledge that and recognize that the seeds of this on our universities' campuses were sown a long time ago. clearly we've done something that's been problematic, and we need to address it.
I mean, I think there is a real opportunity for university leaders and boards and legislators to have a conversation about their real commitment to free speech, free inquiry, a diversity of ideas. Now, there are a lot of people on the right who rightfully look at some universities and think that they're being hypocritical. For years, they were silencing voices that were out of vogue, that they weren't doing a very good job of protecting free speech. And now suddenly free speech is used to defend some of these things that are happening. So there's a lot of anger about that I think is justified. But this is an opportunity for a university community to say, do we really believe in a wide array of opinions? And sometimes the fights that come out of that, does that lead to better learning if we teach young people civility and accommodation and how this leads to better ideas in the long run? What we can't have is any type of education system pick and choose which ideas are going to be protected and which are not, apart from the most radical, hateful, dangerous ideas like Wayne was just talking about that just cannot be tolerated. But if a university is committed to a diversity of ideas, committed to free speech, that needs to be a principle that holds over all times, and that is going to lead to student protests about civil rights, student protests about apartheid, student protests about after 9/11, about the Occupy movement, like lots of things. We're going to have to get accustomed to that being part of the university community, but we need the university community to commit to free speech across the board. And that means even left-leaning universities protecting speakers who come in who are right of center, and these students that Wayne referred to earlier, some students who want to raise questions who feel silenced because of the environment on the campus. I believe in free speech. I want to defend it through and through, but I want to defend free inquiry across the board.
So I guess there's a dimension here that I'm wondering about. Because I mean, it seems to me that partly this goes to why institutions of higher ed exist. And right, I mean, they don't exist necessarily to provide pretty backdrops for marches or convenient places for, neo-homeless camps. The Columbia or NYU students can go over to Grand Central Park and do that. There's lots of places. I mean, it seems to me institutions of higher ed are supposed to be educational. So that's about teaching and learning and inquiry. And so I understand teach-ins about Gaza. I understand guest speakers and having a viewpoint neutral stance. But it seems to me that right, there's universal agreement that colleges have the right to establish time, place, and manner restraints. And for some reason, the notion seems to be that they should try to make these as modest as possible, because it's important that students be able to wave flags and stomp around, whatever the cause. And I guess I'm just curious. I mean, it seems to me we could make the other stance as conservatives that yes, we should be viewpoint neutral. Yes, we should respect the right of students to make arguments, whether we think they're wrong-headed or not. But that ultimately the business of colleges and universities should be teaching and learning and research, and therefore they should be aggressive about making sure that folks are not disrupting those activities. Curious reactions, pushback, response.
No, I think, look, it comes back to what we even talked about at the start of this conversation of institutions viewing themselves as formative versus performative, and it seems to me an institution that sees itself as formative would see its students caring about an issue, caring about the war in Gaza, and respond by saying, how can we bring in experts to talk about this? How can we create, spaces where we can actually become more educated about it, where we can learn more about it, as opposed to sort of, as you're saying, sort of just creating space for these things. Now, look, on the other side of it, part of me thinks, and sort of like Andy said, I was in college during the Iraq war protests. I was in grad school during the Occupy stuff. And part of me wonders, in a lot of these institutions where you put 18 to 22-year-olds and you put 40,000 of them in, Fayetteville, Arkansas, or wherever, like this sort of stuff is going to happen. They're young and they have big feelings about a lot of this stuff. And so creating a space for them to express those things and kind of dip their toe into sort of, I don't know, political activism or things like that, I think when handled well and when created, like as you mentioned, talking about the time, the place, and the manner, making sure that it's done in a way that doesn't disrupt other people is as much a sort of escape valve for a lot of kind of late teens and early 20s finding themselves. Which I don't think's like the end of the world. Like we got through the Iraq protests, we got through the Occupy ones, we're all kind of fine on the other side. But I think more, again, the institution going back to saying, how can we treat this as a formative opportunity? How can we treat this as to continue our mission so that our students learn more about whatever they're passionate about? They don't just get to shout whatever they're passionate about at the top of their lungs.
You got it exactly right. So Rick, to your point, the way that I would say this is the ultimate purpose of a university is this teaching and learning, the accumulation and spread of knowledge. And one load-bearing wall, one of the long poles holding up that tent is free speech, free inquiry, diversity of ideas. That is a necessary but insufficient condition. If you only have that, it's not enough. You need to make sure that this institution also has a set of rules about teaching in a formative way, civility, accommodation, curiosity, having the professors and the staff there telling students, yes, you should be able to protest, but also let's learn together more about this subject, that we have to become citizens as well. So if you're just holding up or just protecting free speech and forgetting those other things, you're not doing the full job of a university, I would say.
Can I be the radical on the panel again and offer, I don't know, maybe, standing out, like living in tents on campus, maybe that is the best way to learn. And there'll be a campus someday where they do that, and good on them for achieving that. But I think the reality is, in fact, that there's this like persistent tension. You look at the administrators that come to Congress to testify, and they seem scared of their students. It's like who's running the show here? And I have a sense it's not so much that anybody thinks this is how it should be, but that culturally we've just landed in this place where the students are running the show, and that institutions don't seem to feel as though they have the privilege of acting as institutions, that they feel this obligation to create platforms. And, part of that is leadership. And that's squishier than I'm comfortable with as an economist. I want there to be some like rules or mechanisms we're talking about here, but somebody maybe needs to say, like, institutions, you can be what you want to be, like put out some rules, decide, do you want to be the encampment campus that, does protest? If that's how your students learn, like, great, we'll see if that works or not. Or do you want to be a campus that prioritizes learning through more traditional mechanisms? And okay, if that's the case, do that and defend that. And you have the right as a private institution to create that space for learning for your students.
Well, and
I always come back.
Have we created this as a luxury good? I mean, you look at these kids who are spending, a lot of somebody's money, our money or their money or somebody's money to go to Princeton or UCLA or Columbia. And I mean, it's part of the problem that they know they're going to graduate, because these institutions graduate everybody, that there's massive grade inflation, that they don't get very much work. And so is part of the response here that we actually just need to reset the culture in terms of expectations and rigor and workload so that they don't have time to cosplay this silliness?
I think somehow we have to give institutions permission to do that. And I don't know where that comes from. If it's putting in place incentives that they have no other option but to have to rein things in, it's like, we can't meet these standards that the government is putting in place unless we rein things in and, bring higher expectations to our faculty and our students. Or if it's cultural, I don't know. That one's harder for me.
Andy, I mean, can boards play a role in doing that? Or is that a ridiculous way to think about the challenge?
No, certainly boards can boards cannot hire and fire beyond presidents in most cases, but boards can do a whole lot on policies and practices that administrators are supposed to hold to. The things that you raise money for, the things that you prioritize, whether a system or an entire campus, certainly boards can play a big role in all of this, including like there are rules about tenure that sometimes are just determined by campus officials, sometimes by a board, how budgets are spent, whether new programs are created. A board that wants to engage in some of these questions like use of time could absolutely do so. And if it's a public institution, the legislature can decide what we're going to pay for or not. But like Beth is making a really compelling point, I think, about maybe this is a moment where there's going to be more diversification among the sector of higher education, where different universities are going to be able to decide what they want to be. And maybe we see coming out of this is some number of universities saying what we saw is what we want to become, and others saying what we saw is not what we want to become. And then they're going to unbundle, or they're going to have different rules on free speech, inquiry, diversity of political views, speakers. Maybe that's what we're going to see.
All right. Actually, speaking of which, related question, U.S. is experiencing a significant decline in career schools, leading to severe shortage of skilled workers. Implications are far-reaching. Where will this need be fulfilled in the near future? Andy, you've spent a lot of time thinking about this.
I mean, this is, I think this is as interesting a question for higher education to deal with as anything. And I've talked too much. So let me just briefly say it here. We could view four-year institutions as just doing four-year degrees and then masters and PhDs, and then allow two-year, whether professional schools or community colleges, to think much more about the careers. That has a mindset behind it that the four-year college experience is meant to do a whole host of things apart from just prepare you for a career, giving you the skills and dispositions you need for it. So that is one way of thinking about it. But a lot of universities and colleges and administrators and boards are thinking we need to serve more people better, and we need to serve our states and the jobs of the future. And that is going to mean licenses, badges, all types of credentials that are not four-year. And so that could dramatically change what a four-year institution does. If instead of having 99% of its students get four-year degrees, masters, PhDs, if that goes down to 75% because people are there to get badges and licenses, does that mean that we're going to change funding formulas or the Pell Grant so it can fund that instead of 4 years? So the overarching question here is, to what extent are four-year institutions going to get into the business of non-four-year credentials? And there's a big push to do that because that's where the students are, especially non-traditional students. But again, going back to my comment at the beginning, if we think there is something special about the four-year traditional experience, does it change in a meaningful and in a long-term deleterious way what that institution is if it starts to chase all these different types of priorities? Does it compromise the fidelity of what a four-year university is? That's the kind of question I think that boards and staff need to be thinking about.
All right, some bunch of good questions. I want to make sure we hit some of these. So I'm just going to give them to one person, and let's try to get through some of these. Wayne, elite colleges graduate close to 100% of their students in 4 years. Average college graduates something like 60%. Even accounting for grade inflation, that difference is huge. Is that evidence that elite colleges do a better job educating students, that they're better prepared, that average college accepts too many students? What's going on?
I think most people work in higher education, especially higher education administration, know the quickest, easiest, most sure way to impact your graduation rate is to change your admission standards. That doesn't do a whole lot to educate students well. So I think the question of what a graduation rate is, what the percentage of students who graduate, and how well an institution is doing at educating a student, I think they're certainly related. We should certainly watch graduation rates. They're important, but they don't tell nearly the whole story. I mean, for example, you look at community and technical colleges, two-year schools. If you're only looking at graduation rates, you might think we should shut them all down tomorrow. But we know, in fact, they serve an incredibly important purpose and probably need to serve a much bigger proportion of the population. So I think we need a lot more indicators to look at in determining how well those institutions are performing.
All right, Mike, lots of people lament that college degrees are required for too many jobs, but it seems like it's hard to beat degrees as hiring criteria, at least in terms of convenience. How do employers sort out potential hires without resorting to degrees?
Yeah, we write about this in the book, and there's a long kind of convoluted legal history of why it is so convenient to have BAs for those things. And I think that that's the sort of thing that needs to change, that the sort of tests that are applied to other hiring tests are not applied to BAs. And while I am loath sort of as Beth talking about it as an economist, adding these things, I'm sort of loath as a conservative to be like, what we should do is like add more complicated tests and weighing things. I think that we really need to rethink, the way that bachelor's degrees are used. And it's more so either hold bachelor's degrees to the same level of scrutiny or create more space in other areas to not hold these other things to quite as high of a bar, so that other things can be just as easy as bachelor's degrees and could be much better correlated to what employers actually want.
Well, and Mike, and one of the things we talk about, right, is there's also been underinvestment in the kinds of 1 day or 6 hour kind of training and assessment exercises because people will leave, because, right, the degrees are free to employers. So why bother?
Sure.
Question: what are some examples of colleges that have gotten higher education right?
I would say Houghton University.
The University of Maryland system.
Yeah, give me an opportunity for a shameless plug. We put in costs front and center. Made sure that cost is a minimal barrier, even for students who come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, really skewing financial aid in that direction, and been completely transparent about who we are. I think whether you're a public or a private institution, a measure of transparency would be really important. So there's no question. You go to my website, we are a Protestant evangelical Christian university that prioritizes an academically challenging education. If you're looking for an institution that where your theology is not interwoven in what you do, we're not the institution for you. If you're looking for an institution where you really can kind of skate by and get B's and C's, we're not the institution for you for that either. I think being much more transparent in the marketplace of higher education of who you are and who you're not, I think people appreciate that.
All right, let's other institutions.
I want to celebrate Western Governors University here in Salt Lake City. They're an innovative campus doing competency-based online education. They have fantastic completion rates and job placement rates and low cost. So I think they've done a great job of embracing innovation while still playing in the same marketplace as traditional schools.
So obviously, I'm a backer of the University System of Maryland, but it goes to this larger point that, like, our state system, like, reflects the needs of the state, having a flagship, having a major online university, having Frostburg, which is in the western part of the state, a very rural area, Salisbury on the east part of the state, near the Atlantic Ocean, 3 HBCUs. These schools serve the needs of Maryland well. So I've been doing some research on where public leaders in America have gone to school. And what is striking to me is how important the publics are to each particular state. But more than that, like 1 or 2 privates in the state. So a vast majority of the leaders of Mississippi went to Ole Miss, but also a lot of them went to Millsaps, which is a private school there. In Georgia, lots and lots of public leaders, including lawyers at the most prestigious firms, went to Georgia State, Georgia Tech, but also Emory, a great private school. University of Denver is very important, as is BYU in the Mountain West. So there's all this attention given to this small number of elite Ivy schools, when in fact great schools in great regions are doing important things for their students that don't get a whole lot of attention, but they are producing the next generation of great leaders.
Mike, we're just about time. Let me give you the last word to take us out. Calls for optimism, right? This is about how, getting it right, what we can do. Take us out.
Look, I think number one is sort of institutions I'm looking at, like the SEC is looking better and better, right? I mean, not just the specific things that were done at the University of Florida, but, just hearing from lots of people that they seem to not be in these. The point that I think I want to make, and something that we try to emphasize in the book, and we've talked about it a couple times, is, the numbers that we're talking about here on some of these campuses that are doing crazy things. I was looking at Washington University. I graduated from St. Louis U, so I have a little schadenfreude every time the school that was much better and posher and just a couple miles down Lindell Boulevard in St. Louis, anytime anything bad happens there. But I was just following because they had particularly ridiculous protests and the things the kids were saying were crazy. But they had, so they arrested a bunch of these people that were having this sort of encampment. They arrested, I think, about 100 people on campus. When the numbers actually shook out, it was 23 students and 6 faculty members. And I'm like, that's what is like holding this school back. There's 8,000 undergrads, 8,000 graduate students. Because of the heavy-handed tactics, an open letter was signed by, I think, 100 faculty members decrying the university. There are more than 4,000 faculty members at that institution. So part of me thinks, and I hope that more and more leaders of these institutions will see in these instances that these are small numbers of students that are not representative of the vast numbers of kids who want to, and older people as well, who want a good education, who want to learn, who want to exchange ideas in respectful ways. And the more the kind of mask slips on all of these, ironically, because they're all wearing masks, but the more this is happening, that I hope that more and more university leaders will wake up to this, will recognize that these are small fringe groups that are giving their entire institution a bad name. They're ruining key moments, graduation, making the end of semesters go online, ruining things for the vast majority of their students, and will take heart in that, and will do much better in the future.
Hey, I just want to say thank you to all of y'all for a terrific conversation. For viewers who feel moved to pick up a copy of the book after this, again, if you go to the Teachers College Press website, thank you, man. Dude, you and Vanna White, man. Love it. If you want to go pick up a copy, type AEI as the promo code. You get a 20% discount. Also, for those of you who may have missed our earlier conversations, getting it right on K-12 and on early childhood, you can find all of those on the AEI website. Thanks to all 4 of you for both the work you do and for just a terrific conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Be well and talk soon.